I am excited to talk about this topic today. I think it's an area where we have not always done a great job of in the prospect of preparing residents to actually independently perform and practice once they're all said and done. I think this is an area that doesn't come naturally to a lot of folks, and at least for me personally, were things that most of which I learned after my residency was completed, and as I stumbled through things as a new faculty member. I don't have anything to disclose that's related to this talk, but I do have a couple disclaimers. The first is that this is mainly a talk about how I invest and manage finances. There are, I'm certain, other people that would argue with many of the things that I'll discuss as being the what I view to be the best pathway forward. And so take that with a grain of salt. I'm also not a financial advisor or an investment advisor, and so please don't constitute this as financial advice. But I do think that in a lot of cases, it can be quite valuable to meet with a professional. I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. And so if you have a complex situation, or if you don't want to learn some of this on your own, then it's a great idea to meet with an expert and a professional who does this every day. So you have spent half your lifetime preparing to practice medicine. And in general, especially in urology, we get compensated very well because what we do is very challenging. Especially as you enter into practice, some of the things that you do now and the habits that you develop can have huge consequences for your long-term ability and timing to retire and to develop wealth. And so the earlier you can develop some of these habits and start to do some of these investments that we'll talk about, then the better off you'll be. There are a number of, I think, keys to developing wealth, but I tried to distill this down to the 5 probably most important things to do. And some of these things are things you should be doing even as a resident and even now. And others are things that you might not have the means to do until you get to be a little bit further along and actually into practice when your salary and your income will grow and be larger than it is now. But these are some of the 5 things that we're going to talk about with a little bit more detail. So the first is I think, from an overarching standpoint, it's a good to have a written financial plan. And as you go through life and practice, you will have some sort of predictable things that will come along the pathway. And so most folks follow this sort of arc of their finances in preparation for retirement. And that's the ultimate goal, is to be financially independent, such that you can retire and not have to compromise your lifestyle in the way that you spend money and the things that you like to do now once you're ultimately finished. So I think this is sort of having a plan of what you would for how you're going to invest, how much you're going to invest, how that's going to be broken down. When do you rebalance your portfolio? When do you make certain purchases and those sorts of things, and then really trying to stick to that financial plan. And some of the things that we'll talk about today would be elements that would naturally go into a financial plan. There are some things that you certainly should do in probably a particular order as your income starts to grow. And I think in general, this sort of pyramid is a good representation of which things you should be doing first, and then second, and then third, and so on and so forth, and where you should route your resources and your investments as you start this process. And then once you get to a place where you have taken care of many of the things that are on this list each year, then you would migrate to the next one. But one of the first keys is to have an emergency fund. I think that should be either cash or something that's easily sold and able to be liquid, something that you can get to very quickly, and that could float you for somewhere between 3 and 6 months. And so you could develop a budget and look at what you tend to spend on things, take into account all the expenses that you have, and try to have at least 3 months and even as long as 6 months of that put away. And that's probably the first thing you should do. This pandemic has really been eye-opening, I think, because a lot of physicians felt like a position in healthcare was really immune to a lot of the market forces that would lead to somebody losing a job or those sorts of things. But other things can happen as well. You can have a medical emergency that comes up, or any sort of unexpected expense. You can have a flood or damage or things like that happen to your home. Most folks, if they have a significant other and are pooling their resources, your significant other may not be sheltered from things like we often are in healthcare. And even within healthcare, at UW, there are some of the administrative staff and such that are being asked to be furloughed. And so you often hear from people that are in practice, physicians that are in practice through this, that their income drops unexpectedly. And so having this money around is really important so that you can survive an emergency. Once you have that taken care of, then I think the next thing that's really important is to have a clear plan for your debt. There are some of these things that fall into what you should do as a resident and then as a new faculty member or a new attending. The first and foremost is to eliminate credit card debt. Anything that has an interest rate or a loan that is a higher percentage, you should really be targeting first, even before you invest some of the money into a retirement plan or an investment. The rates on credit cards are crazy, as everybody knows, and you can spend a lot of additional money just on the interest that goes towards those credit cards. So trying to pay those off quickly and first is advisable. And if you can do it as a resident, that's a good plan. Credit cards should not really be used to develop credit, and you really should develop a habit of paying off your credit card completely every month. So that you don't have to carry that balance because the interest rates are crazy. The next is to have a plan about your student loans. So the 2018 AUA resident census, which was the last time that they asked, showed that about 27% of residents owed more than $250,000. There's another 27% that owed between $150,000 and $250,000. And it's shocking to me that actually 22% didn't have any student loans. But if you're in that group, like I was, where you had significant loans, either for you or you and your partner, you really need to make a plan about whether you're going to pursue one of the forgiveness programs that I'll talk about in just a minute. And if you're not, then to refinance and to make a goal off these student loans as quickly as you can. Right now, for anybody who has federal loans, they're not accruing interest, and the requirement for payments have been suspended for a period of time. But once you refinance those, once you consolidate those, the goal should be to find the lowest possible rate that you can and to pay them off as quickly as you can. It's also, almost cliche that a lot of folks, when they finish their training, they buy the new fancy car or they move to a new city and take on a really big mortgage. You will have become accustomed to spending a certain amount of money based on your resident salary, which for most people is somewhere, less than $100,000, but more than 60, somewhere in that ballpark. And your income is going to increase pretty dramatically over the first year or two that you're into practice. And that is a perfect time to continue to spend conservatively and to try to save money and to pay off these high interest loans and your student loans. So continue to drive that modest or crappy car that you have. And even if you're going to relocate, I think you can look at a lot of these things as sort of a reward for paying off your loans. So if you can, a lot of folks will try to not buy a home and not buy the fancy car until their student loans are paid off. The other thing that is also worth talking about is you can, this is probably true over the course of your whole investing career. You need to be vigilant about where you are conservative with your finances, and there are lots of folks who nickel and dime all along the way, only to overspend on a home, and then to be house poor and to have a mortgage that consumes a really large amount of their monthly income and net income that they can spend. It also is worthwhile to splurge and keep your spouse or significant other happy, because that is money that is very well spent, because divorce can be exceptionally expensive. And fortunately, physicians, especially physicians who marry physicians, have divorce rates that are quite a bit lower than the general public. But that's another area where skimping and being thrifty to the detriment of your life partner is not advised. The other thing is that as you prepare for having a higher income, it's also important to be aware that your credit score can impact the interest rates that you'll get on loans for things like a car and a home, and sometimes can prevent you from being able to get one. This has a list of some of the things that are taken into account by the credit score companies when they determine what your credit score is. And so your payment history, which essentially means, do you pay off your things on time, or do you have late payments, or have you ever defaulted on a loan or a credit card, or those sorts of things, can have a huge impact on your credit score. Other than having something that is not true wiped off your credit score or your credit report, it takes slow, steady progress to improve your credit score. So this is more of a marathon than it is a sprint. And so, making sure that you have some debt that you, or some loans that you have made regular payments on can be helpful. And having an account or two that is older, even if you're not using it regularly, is also advisable. So in thinking about your student loans, I debated about not including really much of anything about student loans, since this was more about your personal finances, but they really are so related that it's difficult to not at least include them to some degree. Student loans, I think, they come in a couple different categories. The private loans don't really have the opportunities for these different repayment programs for the most part. And so any private loans that you took out in order to go interview all over, or really for any other reason, you should really try to refinance those to the lowest rate possible and try to make some payments to them during residency. Residency is like 5 to 6 years long, plus if you do any additional training after that, and to just allow those loans to accumulate interest, really be problematic. Once you finish, they can grow and be quite a bit more difficult to pay off. For your federal loans, there's definitely some choices about how to pursue this, and this is probably the area of the talk where I have the least experience. But in general, you should consider an income-driven repayment plan, and there's a couple of them. They're nuanced, and there's lots of really slight differences between them. They also have changed, and there are new programs that have come on over the last couple years. But in general, these income-driven repayment plans are a good pathway, because they allow you to still preserve the opportunity for a forgiveness program, which I'll talk about in just a minute. They each have sort of a different way of calculating what your payment would be, and in general, they're mostly capped at what your at a maximum number, and they're based on your discretionary income. So there's some strategies that you can take to make your discretionary income actually be a smaller number. and such that your payments are smaller. And there are some slight differences, but in general, most folks are going to be best served by either the pay or the repay program. And most folks end up in the pay program if you don't qualify for this subsidy. And that happens either because your family income, often due to a high earning spouse, is too high, or the amount of debt you have is too low. So if you're single and you qualify for it, most folks pursue the repay program because the interest that you would be charged is subsidized, and so that can be beneficial for the loan. Now, when you get to a place of repayment, then you really have a couple choices. When you get to a place where you're finished and now you're in the process of trying to repay your loans, there's sort of a fork in the road where you have to decide if you're going to pursue a forgiveness program or if you're going to pursue repayment. The repayment programs that come through the federal government, are often not very favorable. So I'm going to talk about those in just a minute, but the standard repayment is a 10-year repayment. So they take whatever your owed amount is, they include what your interest rate is, and then they divide it out such that you'd make payments and have it paid off within 10 years. You can switch that to an extended program, which allows you to repay over about 25 years. And then you can always take your loans out of the federal repayment programs and you can consolidate them and then refinance them, and then set a term actually that is anywhere between 5 and 20 years. Oftentimes these have lower rates with shorter terms. So if you commit to having payments such that you repay your loans within 5 years, your interest rate is often quite a bit lower, but that results in much higher monthly payments. So there's some balance that you have to find there. And in general, I would say if you do go this route, try to find a number that's a monthly number that is a little bit conservative, because you can always pay extra on these, but you don't want to end up in a place where you commit to a 5-year repayment and then you get to a place where you can't make a payment because it's just too large. Now, there are a couple of forgiveness programs. There's many of them that have big problems, and so there's a couple things you need to be aware of. And again, this is just sort of a cursory covering, but if you started out in the income-based repayment and then you continue on that income-based repayment and you make 25 years of payments, then you get the remainder of your loan balance forgiven. But remember that the payment is set up so that you're paying over 10 years. So oftentimes the loans would already be paid off. And then a big problem is that when you do have the loan be forgiven, that counts it's taxed as income, ordinary income. So you oftentimes, if you structure this correctly and you have a large amount forgiven, the tax consequences can be giant. And so that is not a great forgiveness plan. The same is true for the pay program. So you can be in the pay program through residency, but to be in it long-term is not typically advisable, because you have the same problem where the loans are sometimes paid off. They are capped, which is nice, but anything that's forgiven is taxed as income. And so that is also not a great program. One of the problems with the repay program is that it's not capped. And so when they figure out the amount of what your monthly payment is going to be, it can substantially increased from what it would be in one of these other programs, because it's based on, again, your discretionary income. And so in a high paying field like urology, your payment can increase dramatically and be really high. And again, the forgiveness is taxed. And so all three of those programs in terms of forgiveness are not great programs. And so that really essentially leaves the public service loan forgiveness program. And there's some nuances to this one, but it results in tax-free forgiveness. And so the strategy with a forgiveness plan is to have your loan, when you finish, how you want that that's forgiven to be as large as possible, because it means that you over the lifetime of the repayment of the loan, you paid the least amount into it. And the PSLF is the only one where the forgiveness is tax-free. So that's huge. There are some things you definitely need to be aware of. You essentially have to work full-time, which means 30 hours a week. And so if your intent is to graduate and then work part-time, that this program doesn't work great for you. You have to you have to make 120 payments, which means 10 years of payments, and be working and have your income become through a 501c3 nonprofit. And that means your actual income comes from that nonprofit. If you work in a private practice and cover a nonprofit hospital, but your salary comes through your private practice, that does not count. The program also administratively has some trouble, and it's only over the last year or two, that people have actually been able to try and get forgiveness in this program. And their logistics of having them participate in knowing that you made these payments is terrible. And so really the onus goes to you to make sure that you're keeping proof of every one of these payments that you make on time. So essentially how this should work out is that when you're a resident, you want an income contingent or some sort of income-based program that's based on your discretionary income. And then if you think PSLF is possible, then you want to switch to the pay program as an attending, and then go for the public student loan forgiveness program. Now, some of the things that make that possible, in urology, programs are 5 and 6 years. That counts towards the 10 years or 120 payments that you need to make. If you do a fellowship beyond that, you conceivably could be 8 years into this process of the 10 years that you need to do. And then you'd have 2 years where you'd be in the pay program and you'd be paying at a higher rate for your discretionary income, but you could have 80% of the payments done by the time you get into practice. But you ultimately do have to get into practice, and really it means either an academic job, a hospital employed position at 501(c)(3). You can work in the VA, that counts. And you also, if you work in the military, that meets the requirement as well. If you think it's not likely and you're going to take a private practice position, then really the goal should be to refinance your loans and to pay them off as quickly as you can. So I'm going to transition here just a little bit. There's sort of 2 phases of wealth. The first is you are accumulating wealth, and then in the end, you end up retired and hopefully have lots of money to spend. If you think about the amount of money that you're going to make, which the average is around $400,000 a year for fitting into practice. There's some variation for sure, depending on if you're in an urban area or rural, and definitely by geography. But in general, the starting salary is somewhere around $400,000 for new urologists. Your goal should be to save about 20% of your gross income. And the interesting thing is these percentages tend to work even if your income is less. So if your income is you work half time, so it's only $200,000, or you're married to a neurosurgeon and your income is closer to $1 million a year. These percentages work out in what you have when you finish, and when you're coming into retirement, and what you can survive on. And so in general, you have to remember that you don't get to keep all $400,000. You only get to keep a portion of it. And you can plan on having about 20% of your gross income be directed towards retirement and savings in different methods that we'll talk about in a minute. Often some of those are reduce your income that's taxable, but nonetheless, if you make about $400,000, you end up paying about $100,000 in taxes, which is crazy, but true. You can allocate about 15% of your gross income towards your mortgage. That how much your mortgage is obviously depends a lot on where you live, but about a $60,000 a year mortgage gets you about $1 million house if you bring a down payment, so somewhere in that ballpark. So that 15% might be less in some places and it might be more in others. And then that leaves you with about 40% of your income to be what you live on, about $160,000. Now, when you get to retirement, you have the benefit of you can figure out what you sort of need to survive on. So that $400,000 income, you don't need to save the 20% anymore. So that makes that starting point about $80,000. Your taxes are much lower because the amount of income that you're generating much less. Oftentimes that's money that's coming out of your retirement, but you can plan on a rate that's about 15% instead of 25%. Your mortgage may be gone completely at that point, but if you retire early, you may have some mortgage expenses that you have left over, and that leaves you with a lifestyle to survive on in retirement that's about 6% of what your gross income was before you retired. And most programs would say, most books would say that you should aim for about a 60 to 80% of your pre-retirement income. And that will allow you to do all the things that you do when you're retired. You can still travel and you can still take trips and all the things that you like to do now. Now, that doesn't all have to come from your retirement account. If you take that $240,000 that you're going to live on, which is about 60% of your pre-retirement gross income, some of that comes from Social Security. And so on average, assuming that it exists when we get to that place, Social Security nets about $44,000 a year. And you end up with about $200,000 that you'd be pulling out of your retirement account on an annual basis. Now, some of that is going to go to taxes. So about $46,000 of it would go to taxes. And then you end up with this number that's about $194,000 to live on, or call it $200,000 to live on, which most folks can live just fine on that amount. Now, if you take that $200,000, how much do you need? And most of the advice would say that you need about 25 times whatever that number is for you. And so if it's $200,000 that you are going to plan to pull out of your retirement account, then you're going to be retired for about 30 years, then you need about 25 times that much, or about $5 million. Now, obviously, if this number is going to be different for everybody. And some people will require more and some will require less. But that at least gives you a ballpark of what to shoot for. Now, the nice thing is that you eventually get to a place where your retirement account has enough money in it. And if it is continuing to grow, this 4% withdrawal that you do each year, that's about $200,000, is actually about what the account makes, or sometimes it's even less than what the account makes. And so as you get closer to retirement, it's often nice to see that the amount of money that goes into your retirement account just from it growing on its own can be more than your salary, can be more than your income. I have not yet experienced that, but I look forward to it. Now, how do you save the money? Where do you do with the amount of money that you're going to save? This 20% of your gross income, which is about $80,000. Where does that go? And this is where it gets to be a little bit of sort of alphabet soup, and knowing some of the terminology is important. So first, a pre-tax contribution means that money comes out of your gross income before taxes are applied. This is really beneficial, especially when your incomes get higher, because it reduces the amount of your income that has to be taxed. And so your taxable income gets reduced. It also means that if you're going to contribute the same amount, if you're going to set aside, $5,000 or whatever the amount is, that money doesn't decrease before it gets into the account. If the money gets taxed and you use it after tax, you have less money to put in, or it costs more to put it in. And you want that money to be in the account as early as possible so it can start to grow and compound the interest. And I'll show you some examples of that in just a minute. Now, during the time that it's growing and you have an investment, there are two things that sometimes happen with it. So capital gains is essentially a term that's used for whatever change in value you have in an equity that you've purchased, so a stock or a mutual fund. And so the gain would be, I bought it at $10 and now it's worth $12, and so the gains would be $4 for each share. Those do not get applied until you sell it, and so those are not realized, and the actual gain is not doesn't have any impact on your taxes or your income until you actually sell whatever the item is, the equity. That's important because capital gains get taxed in a different way than income and some of these other things. Now, dividends, on the other hand, those are periodic payments that come from some investments where they give essentially profit. They share it with the shareholders. And so it's usually a small amount of money for each share of stock that's owned. And you can either automatically reinvest that, or you can withdraw it and use it. But every time a dividend happens, if it's in a taxable account, if it's not in like a 401k or a 403b, then that's a taxable event. And so those get accumulated and they get filed on your taxes each year. And then a withdrawal is when you take the money out. So that's when you get into retirement, or if you have some sort of an emergency beforehand, it's when you are taking money out of one of these retirement accounts. So there's a bunch of different choices, and they're nuanced, and there are definitely some differences between them. And so most people, when they start in a position, and even as a resident, there is a 401k or a 403b retirement option, and those are pre-tax money. So money comes out of your check, you never see it. It does not tax in that account as it grows, and there's dividends, and there's any growth on the money. But then when you withdraw the money, then it does get taxed. So in most of these cases, you get taxed one place or another. The benefit of being taxed later is that you're not making $400,000 a year at that point. You're withdrawing less and living on less, and so the amount of tax you actually pay is less. Now, there's also IRAs. Those are also come out pre-tax. There are some limits on how much you can contribute based on what your income is. The growth is not taxed, and then it does get taxed when you withdraw. A health savings account is sort of a stealth version of an IRA. You pull pre-tax money out. It doesn't get taxed during as it grows, and then it does get taxed when you withdraw it if you use it for non-healthcare reasons. But if you use retirement for healthcare, then it's not taxed. So some people say that an HSA is triple tax advantaged because for that reason, it doesn't get taxed when you are contributing it. It doesn't get taxed when it grows, and it doesn't get taxed when you use it if you use it on healthcare. Now, there's also Roth versions of an IRA, and these are after-tax money. So you earn your $400,000, you get taxed a certain amount, and then the money that you actually get in your paycheck, you can contribute to a Roth IRA. This also has a limit to it. It is not taxed during growth. And then the benefit of a Roth IRA is that it's not taxed when you withdraw money because you've already paid the tax on it. There's also a 401k version of a Roth as well that has that same sort of setup. And so you can decide if you want your 401k to be a traditional 401k or a Roth 401k. There are books entirely and chapters of other books that are written on this specific question of which do you do for your 401k, a traditional or Roth version. And there's tons of variables and nuances that go into it. And so, but in general, most experts would say that in your low income years where the amount you get taxed is going to be low, that's a reasonable time to use a Roth vehicle like this. And when you have high income years, so when you're in your peak earning years, then you really want to defer and use the pre-tax money. And then the last thing is a taxable account. So there's nothing that stops anybody from, once you've done some of these other things that have limits, that to contribute additional money to a Fidelity or Vanguard or whatever taxable account. And in those cases, you are contributing after-tax money. You get taxed on the dividends when those happen, and then when you start to withdraw some of the money, or if you make any, if you sell any of the stocks, then you have to pay tax on those gains. When you actually are pulling the money out, then you don't. But you do have to sell the items in order to use them. Now, so how do you fill this savings bucket, right? So we talked about how we're going to contribute around $80,000 a year. That sounds like a lot. And there's a bunch of different ways to do it. So the first is to use your 401k or 403b, and those have a limit of 19.5 for an individual. You can contribute a little bit more. It's like 6,000 or 6,500 more if you're over the age of 50. They call it catch up. And again, if you have an account and your significant other has an account, you both can do this 19.5. Oftentimes, employers will have a match, and so if you contribute to this and say they'll match up to 5% of your salary, for example, but the maximum that you get to, including what you put in and your employer, is $15,000. There's some leeway there for that to be a little higher if you're over 50. An IRA or a Roth IRA has a $6,000 limit, and your taxable account, you can put as much as you want. The sky is the limit for that. You also, if you make over about $130,000, automatically money comes out of your check to support Social Security until you hit that maximum number. So about $17,000 goes into your Social Security. And then there's a couple of other ones. I put these others in because they're not always available. And for example, a pension, there are some places that still have a pension, but they're more uncommon now than they were before. But a 457B is a special deferred income program. They come in two big buckets of either a government or a non-governmental. A governmental one is very safe, and you can contribute another 19.5 to that. And essentially, you give the money into that account, you direct it towards some sort of an investment, and then you basically defer your salary. You get paid later on. Though the governmental ones are sort of insured and have they're backed, basically. But the ones that are non-governmental, the 457 plan, if a giant company you'd feel more safe with, but if they declared bankruptcy or went out of business, then that money could be lost. So a non-governmental one, there is some risk there. You have to decide what the likelihood is of that happening. And then your health savings account, you can contribute a little over $3,500 towards that as well. Now, the fourth key is you want to maximize all the tax-protected retirement accounts, including and especially for the matching. So these are done sort of in order. And whether you're a resident or an attending, if the company you work for offers a match, you should do whatever it takes to maximize that match. That is free money. Even if you turn around at the end of your training and liquidate your retirement plan, which you shouldn't do, but if you had to, they have given you 5% for nothing, and you have to pay a penalty, and there's taxes and all these other consequences, but you always take free money. And then the next step, which you might be able to do as a resident, probably not, but as an attending, you want to try and maximize whatever your retirement plan is going to be, whether it's a 401k or a 403b is what I have done, and I would say most do. It saves on what your taxes will be, and it allows you to have the amount of money that goes into your account to start contributing. But you got to have the money to be able to afford to set aside 19.5. So that's more of when you get into practice. Now, a backdoor Roth I'll talk about in just a minute, but that's sort of the next step in the attending world, in that the hierarchy or the triangle that I showed before. The nice thing about a backdoor Roth is that it's tax-free growth and tax-free withdrawal. And I'll talk about that, I think, in the next slide or one after that. And then consider a health savings account if that works for you. And so if you do the math, then what it means is that to get to that $80,000 a year, you withhold your 401k or 403b, you maximize the match that you'd get from your business that you work for, or your hospital that you work for. You do a backdoor Roth each year, that's $6,000. You might use an HSA, you might not. And then you have, around $30,000 that plus or minus a bit that you would contribute in a taxable account. And so with an income that's in the $400,000 range, that taxable account becomes a move that we as urologists probably should move to earlier and might move to earlier than folks who have an income that's a bit lower. So there you go. Then you get to your $80,000 a year. Now let's talk a little bit about timing. So I've got a couple graphs here that show the differences of when you invest and sorts of things. And so this is a graph that has 4 lines on it. And so on the bottom is the number of years that you're investing. And on the left side is how that money grows. And so this is just an example of investing $5,000 a year, which again, we're talking about investing way more than that. And if you invest it for 30 years, like many of your college buddies who got into business at age 25, they have the most favorable growth curve. If you're like most physicians where you're entering into that world closer to age 35, you're already starting out way behind. And so if you're going to invest over that same time period, to say 30 years, you're going to retire somewhere between 55 and 65, then you end up with a really big difference just by waiting 10 years. That 10 years of compounded growth results in a 2.3-fold difference in the amount of money. And that 2.3-fold, this is only a $5,000 example. So if you just use the 19.5, for example, it's still 2.3 times different between the two. And if you finish your training and then you delay and say, well, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to hold off, then the difference is even more dramatic. So this is obviously, a 20-year delay, and which none of us should do. But the effect that has on how you finish with is really dramatic. Now, interestingly, if you look at, can't change where we are, right? We're in this going to finish residency at about this 10 years after, our colleagues, for example. If you look at how difficult it is to catch up, you have to invest about 11.5 or 2.3-fold more if you start 10 years late to catch up by that overall 30-year time period. So to get that steeper slope, you have to invest a whole bunch more, more than double just by starting 10 years late. And so really trying to make sure that you start to invest as soon as you can, even if it's a small amount, is beneficial, because the longer that money sits in that account, the better off you're going to be. Now, this is an example of the difference between pre-tax money and post money. So, assuming that you invest in something like the S&P 500, which performs about 7% after inflation, and you invest $5,000 a year for 30 years, you have these 3 scenarios. So the $150,000 is you just put it in a piggy bank, right? You stash it in the mattress or put it in your closet, and it doesn't have any chance to grow. If you put it in a pre-tax account, then you generate about 28% more money at that 30-year time period than if you use the same $5,000 and you pay taxes on it first, because the amount of money that goes in is just less. And so there's a benefit of using the pre-tax money. Now the difference is when you finish, as you pull money out of that pre-tax account, you do have to pay taxes on it. But at least for the growth, doing it pre-tax is beneficial. Now the backdoor Roth is a little complicated. I think when I first heard about it, I thought it was like this one-step thing, but it really isn't. For the most part, we don't really qualify because of our income to do a Roth IRA or a post-tax Roth IRA because our incomes are just too high. And so there's these different categories for what your income is, but we pretty quickly get into this high income group, which essentially you're allowed to make an IRA contribution of about $6,000. And you can leave it in an IRA. It's after-tax money, and so it grows tax-free. But then it gets the growth gets taxed in retirement, and it does end up with being in a lower tax bracket. But one of the things that the government has allowed us to do, which I think every year when they revise the tax code, there's some fear that this is going to go away, is once a year you can make a conversion of this $6,000 from an IRA to a Roth IRA. And by having it be in a Roth IRA, you now have it grow tax-free. There's no taxes when you withdraw, and there's no penalties if you withdraw early from it. And so it's limited to $6,000 a year. And this number changes like many of the others do. But this is something that you can do once you can afford it, once a year for both you and your spouse or significant other can both do it. And the first year that you can do it, if you do it early enough in the year, you can actually allocate it to the year prior. So we're too late. Well, actually, we are still okay this year because taxes aren't due until July. But if you did this today, you could make a contribution into your IRA, allocate it as your 2019 contribution, and then roll it over into your Roth IRA. And then you could the very next day do the same thing and designate it as your 2020 contribution. I'm not going to talk a ton about health savings account. A lot of employers like to use them because they're the premiums are less costly. But one of the benefits of a health savings account is that unlike a flexible spending account or an FSA, you have to be careful. These are different. You essentially choose your health insurance to be a high deductible plan, and then you can do an HSA. You can contribute a little over $3,500 a year that's pre-tax, and sometimes, actually oftentimes, your employer will contribute to that as well, to contribute towards the any of the out-of-pocket costs that you might have. And it functions just like an IRA, basically. The catch is that you really should decide if this is the right insurance plan for you first. If you have a bunch of kids, or if you use healthcare a lot, if you have a chronic medical issue, or someone in your immediate family does, this is not a great mechanism to use just for retirement. But if you have this money and you don't use it on healthcare, it accumulates, and you can designate it towards an investment in the account, just like an IRA. Now, the fifth and the last key point is to invest in broad-based index funds. So why do I say that? So you have to decide what you're going to do with all the savings, right? You put this $80,000 into one of a couple different accounts, and you need some sort of a vehicle to invest it in. You have to, the money just sits in like a money market account if you don't purchase something with it. And so in general, what you want is you want diverse holdings, so that you don't have all your eggs in one basket. You want something that's low cost. You want to have a plan about what your distribution is going to be for things. And then you need to rebalance at some interval. For some people, that's once a year. For other people, it's quarterly. And so we're going to talk about these things just a little bit. Index funds are essentially a collection of stocks in a mutual fund. And diversity is really important because since the 1920s, all the value in the stock market has come from the top 4% of stocks. And nobody knows who these are going to be. It's essentially like picking lottery numbers. And so the strategy is you may not have, if you knew which these 4% were, then it would be a home run, right? Because they would grow like crazy. But the problem is that they all look the same. It's hard to pick out the winners from the ones that are going to hold the course or even lose. And so by having an index fund, you own all the stocks in that category. You get their value and you spread out all the risk that you accumulate. And so it may not be the home run, but it also is not the strikeout. Now, the other important point is a lot of the index funds are passively managed. And what that means is that there's not a person at a computer saying, oh, you know, I think this stock is really going to be good. Let's pick this one. Instead, you base it on something. There's a million choices. You can choose all the stock market. You can choose just the S&P 500, pick all sorts of different sizes and categories of companies. You can pick large value, you can pick small growth. All those have different index funds. They have some for bonds, they have some foreign classes of these type funds as well, and then there's even some real estate ones. And the nice thing about choosing something like total market or the S&P 500 is nobody is doing any guessing or math for that. They are, it's essentially a robot. It's, you know, an equation about a program, a company comes into the S&P and the mutual fund or ETF or whatever it is purchases some of that. And so because they're low maintenance, they don't cost very much to run. And so passive funds like a total stock market or something that mirrors the S&P 500 have very little expense ratios. So expense ratios is essentially like a fee or a cost that bridge charges. And the more maintenance they're doing, the more they're having to manage the fund, the higher the fees are. And so some active funds or actively managed funds have expense ratios that are quite a bit higher. They're, you know, 0.5%. Some of them are even over 1%. And that drags on your investment because it's a fee that you have to pay out of that account, and you want all that money sitting in the account. Now, another thing you have to be wary of is a program called assets under management. This was a fee structure that was used for a long time at some of the companies. And basically what it means is whatever you have in your account, they charge some fee every year to take care of it. And so those can be as high as 2%. Most of them are around 1 or 1.25%. You really want to avoid those because you could be paying someone tens of thousands of dollars a year just to make an account. So look for low expense ratios and avoid assets under management structures. If you look at, this is another graph that shows an example. Again, this is just a $5,000 example over 30 years. If you had a conservative investment in something like the S&P 500 or something that mirrored that makes about 7% a year, and you look at what it would you'd end up with if it's fully managed in the blue, actively managed in the green, or assets under management in the orange, you end up with less money over that time period. And that is all just the volume is turned up if you're investing more money in those things. So it can end up being a big difference between them. And so the other way to perceive it is that to have assets under management at a 1.5% be worth it, the investment that they pick would have to be quite a bit better than if you invested in something passively. So a passive, diverse index fund is less aggressive, but probably more predictable over the long run. The last thing is to have a plan. So this goes into your financial plan that you're going to write down. You can use something like 100% life cycle fund. So this is, say, I want to retire it in 2055 or whatever it is. And then they put together this collection of stocks, bonds, et cetera, that are more aggressive when you're young, and then they get more conservative as you get closer to the end. These are actively managed, so the prices are just a little bit higher. All of these are different strategies that some people tout as being the right way to go. But eventually you have to decide, like, how much time do you have until retirement? What's your risk tolerance? And then if you have a distribution like this, that's say 60% stocks and 30% bonds and 10% real estate, periodically you need to look and see, this is how I'm contributing. And then, the stocks are probably going to grow more than the others. And so you need to rebalance and make sure that you're maintaining whatever the percentages are that you decide are the right percentages for you. The last thing is, don't panic and sell when the market drops. Your perspective should be that everything's on sale. Because again, if you have a long term until you're going to need any of this money, then you shouldn't be pulling it out every time the market drops, because you miss the rebounds where it increases as well. If you want to learn more about this, there's a bunch of really good books. These are each really great. The White Coat Investor also has a great podcast and a blog that there's like 150 episodes that some of which are really applicable. If you want to go to a true financial advisor, there's a couple pieces of advice that so the first is ask them how they get paid, and usually an hourly rate or a set fee is a better way than a percentage of the things you invest in. Ask them how they feel about these three things, because if they tell you that whole life insurance is a great plan, you should not be listening to them. These are red flags if they lean towards these things. So these are the take-home points. Have an emergency fund, save about 20% of your gross income, try to maximize your tax-protected accounts and any matching, pay off your high-interest loans, have a plan for your loans, lean towards passive index funds, again, that's my bias, and have a strategy for how you're gonna set up your account and rebalance. And then we didn't really talk much about insurance, but having a term insurance plan is a very reasonable thing to do, especially when you're young. They're very inexpensive. It's probably most important when you have dependents, when you have another or you have kids. And then disability insurance is really important. You know, I could give a whole talk, or actually I couldn't, Dima could, about disability insurance and why it's important. But you know, things come up, and you want to have disability that's specialty specific. There's often some advantages of having that get set up when you're still in your residency, and you never know what's going to happen. You could have something bad happen, and then getting insurance is very hard. That's it for me. I'm happy to field any questions. We'd be to fill out our survey today. There's a link here. I'd love the feedback.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Sorensen. Just a few quick questions. We've got just a few minutes. Going in order, you talked about emergency funds in the beginning and the idea of 3 to 6 months expenses. But for residents, I mean, 6 months would be almost $30,000 or so, which is probably more than any of us have ever seen, other than when we were taking money and then paying it from a loan to a tuition. And then our jobs are seemingly pretty secure. Do you think that 3 to 6 months applies to people when they're in residency?
Well, I think you probably want to have some put away. I think that the 6 month answer is I think it all depends on what your risk tolerance is and what how risky it is that your position or your significant other's position could have an episode of unemployment, or that they could be laid off. And so I think in residency, because the likelihood is that you're going to have a position, and having about 3 months is probably important. But that said, there are people who currently are unemployed or making much less money than they were even 5-6 months ago. And I think some of them wish that they had, I think some people thought they were essentially immune to it, and it turns out we're probably not immune.
Yeah. We got a few questions just now about that last piece, the disability insurance, and people are wondering two sort of related things. First, is it important to get it, as a resident, as a fellow, as an attending? What was the timing for you? And then do you have, the other question was, do you have any specific ones that you recommend, or maybe since there's not time to get into that, a place that people can go for more information?
Yeah, I mean, I think you probably know more about disability insurance than I do. You gave our departmental grand rounds on it, and I looked into disability insurance as a resident and did not do it. I didn't get disability insurance until I was faculty, but I don't, I was late to learn a lot of this stuff. So, and I didn't have anything happen where I didn't have any real medical issues where I would have been disabled, but it definitely can happen. And they're definitely less expensive if you get them earlier.
I think the one thing that I would plug, and you mentioned this also, the White Coat Investor in the blog has a 7-part series on disability insurance. And then at the bottom of that, on every page, there's like a question and answer section where people are asking a lot of really good questions and others who are very knowledgeable going into those. And that I think is a great resource for anyone who wants to really spend a while figuring this out.
Yeah, that's a great comment.
Well, one last question. Where do you think people struggle the most with these steps? Like, you outlined this great plan for what we should all be doing in the next 5 to 10 years. What do you think is like the one biggest pitfall that people succumb to?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the biggest pitfall is failing to have a plan, I think. And I think by tuning in today, everybody that's on this has taken a really good step, right? They're trying to learn more. I think by nature, a lot of physicians are not financially all that literate. We didn't go to medical school for financial reasons usually. We didn't become physicians for that reason. And so it's an area where, a lot of us don't feel all that comfortable and don't have a lot of information and knowledge as a base. I would say of the different steps, you can have pitfalls in all of them, but I think, the being aware and trying to get started as early as you can and developing habits is probably the most important. I'd say the biggest thing that I see people do is they graduate and buy really expensive stuff, and they transition from totally surviving on a salary that's, a resident salary to immediately adjusting to a $400,000 salary and not really having that much more money to show for it or savings to show for it.
Yeah, looking forward to having that problem. Well, thanks again, Dr. Sorensen. Thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Remember to take the survey at the end on the website. Thanks again.